If you look at just the top quartile of intelligence, the big predictor of fertility is that you are conservative and you are religious. We essentially create for ourselves a kind of artificial warm period via civilization. This leads to weakened selection, which will then lead to inclinations which would be normally maladaptive or odd: homosexuality, feminized men, masculinized women, atheism, whatever. And then it also leads to the society just becoming stupider. They've basically taken over parts of California, and it's theirs. It's their land. It's theirs. Mexico. It's Mexico enclave. And they're in power there. But once you have a multi-ethnic society and all kinds of ethnic groups disliking each other and fighting, even the Mexicans and the blacks don't get on. Of course they don't. They're genetically very different. What's interesting is that in Trump, perhaps, we have a kind of Julian the Apostate who is standing up against this. I mean, he could, presumably, if he wanted to, he could really go for it. I don't know why he doesn't. He could just go for it. He could just send in the troops and open fire.
I'm honored today to have with us the Jolly Heretic, at signed Jolly Heretic on X, otherwise known as Edward Dutton. We may call him Ed from time to time. He comes as a complete package, a man of letters, many of them, and he puts them together in often times interesting, intense books. And we're going to talk about some of those, amongst which are Woke Eugenics. Edward Dutton, Professor Dutton, tell us a little about yourself, your journey, and what is of interest to you, and what has you fight the good fight.
My journey? Oh, I don't know about that. But hello, my name's Ed Dutton, and I research evolutionary psychology. I started off when I was a student researching theology, and from there I moved into anthropology, and from there I moved into evolutionary psychology, things like intelligence and group differences in that, and group differences in personality, and the evolution of culture, and that sort of thing. And since 2019, I've had a YouTube channel called The Jolly Heretic, and in the last few years, a Substack called The Jolly Heretic. And I like to research the topics which the mainstream woke joke universities have increasingly banned. So I've written a number of books on these kinds of topics.
I have some familiarity with that. I had a piece that Aporia magazine, Substack, eventually put up called The Smoking Gun. And I'm a medical doctor, and I kind of like to let the facts guide me where they will. And I couldn't get this thing published anywhere. Any of my usual venues. I write for Brownstone, I've written for the Washington Examiner, Daily Skeptic, and whatnot. Anyway, there is kind of a, we have free speech, as it were, somewhat. But a lot of toll booths and a lot of regulations about who's going to print what and when. Have you run across any of those? Kind of like.
Oh God, yeah. I mean, I had an article recently in the Scandinavian Journal of Psychology, and we proved that woke people are on average more mentally unstable than controls, and we proved that this wasn't an artifact. This was a genuine relationship, and the peer reviewers asked us to sort of speculate on why, and I noted, well, look, there's evidence that being far left wing is associated with being narcissistic, and this is why we would expect woke people to be high in narcissism. And on that basis, I was accused of using anti-academic offensive language, and there was a campaign basically by woke people who were narcissistically triggered by being accused of being woke, and the study was withdrawn by the journal. So, and that's only a couple of months ago that happened. I've been asked in interviews in British newspapers to kind of, could you say that again, but in slightly different language, because we're used to the term intelligence might offend people. I've been told by very senior journalists in the UK that they agree with my ideas, but they make sense, but they're just too inflammatory to be reported at the moment. But I've been told that they agree with them in private. I've had articles rejected from academic journals on the grounds that basically the ideas are just offensive and appalling, and how dare you say these things. And so, yes, of course, I'm entirely familiar with this.
So Larry Summers was the president of Harvard. It's probably like maybe 15 years ago now. And I don't know if Harvard was a great institution then. It's had a little bit of fall from grace. And he, I think he's an economist, but he was pointing out that, men and women have different aptitudes for science. And he was basically, kind of screamed at. And he had, the kind of struggle session at Harvard. And I think he was literally screamed off the stage. Um, and the irony is, one of the women who got interviewed for the article I read, she was the professor of, we'll say some science. I'm not sure it's hard science. But she said, when he said that, he actually said that, kind of women have more, an emotional aspect to them, and men tend to be more calculating and whatnot. And she said,
Emotionally, she couldn't cope. Yeah, I
when,
remember.
she,
Yeah.
when he said that, she says, I just broke down in tears. My whole world collapsed. I couldn't believe it. Like,
Yeah, well, I couldn't believe it because this woman is basically a narcissist, and she's also deeply insecure, and so she tells herself that she's wonderful, and then she's confronted with the truth, and it punctures her idea of herself, and so she collapses. The same thing happened when Jim Watson, I think it was about the year 2000 or something like that, made similar kinds of remarks about sex differences at the University of California at Berkeley. And a number of about them being more emotional. A number of females, what they do, reacted extremely emotionally. Only to underline his point. So just as my point about woke people being high narcissism was underlined by the fact that woke people had to then have that paper forcibly withdrawn by the publisher, Wiley and Sons, from the journal. It's an irony that they can't seem to appreciate, but they are more mentally unstable, and that means they are higher in neuroticism, both women and woke people. And that's probably partly why there's such a crossover between the two. They are higher in these kinds of traits. They're more likely to have depression. I think it was more than half of women who identify as far left, who are under the age of 30, in a survey a few years ago in America, were found to have been diagnosed with either anxiety or depression. So half. And then that number goes down the older the women that so identify are. So that's what you're dealing with. Basically, over the last 20 years, we've been forced to increasingly live inside the mind of a 15-year-old girl who has anxiety disorder and cuts herself because she's sad.
yeah, I think her name might be Greta Thunberg.
Her name, well, yeah, Greta Thunberg, but it's more likely to be a sort of very middle class girl from a private school. So whatever kind of name that girl would have, probably Eliza or something like that.
No, true enough. I saw today, somebody was looking at I don't know how they do this, but they have kind of the groups who are rioting currently in LA, and they found 309 of the phones, the signals, whatever, refer to residences of more than $10 million. So that these are kind of the billionaire woke class kids. Now, when you're talking about your book, one of your books is titled Woke Eugenics. I might argue that kind of the opposite is happening simultaneously. That because of the capture by the universities, say the billionaire class, we'll kind of stipulate maybe they are smarter than the average bear. Their kids may not be, and their kids get kind of swirled into a vortex of downward mobility as they buy into the concepts of the university, which is its own set of say middlebrow.
Well, I think we can. I think that's a very interesting point. I think that can be dissected in a number of ways. So, my point in woke eugenics was that in general, what happens is that the society, due to the collapse of harsh Darwinian selection pressures, has witnessed essentially a build-up in mutation. And what we were selected for under harsh Darwinian conditions was to be intelligent, was to be essentially conservative, by which I essentially mean group oriented, as opposed to individually oriented. Because if you are of high status in a group, it's good for you that the system, i.e., the group system, is maintained. Whereas if you are of low status in a group, then it's good for you to get to the top to try and break down that system. And so we, as pack animals, we have two sets of moral foundations: the group-oriented foundations and the individually-oriented foundations. And that's to say, harm avoidance, so you less harm to you, and equality, so you get more, as opposed to obeying the leader, conforming to the group, in-group loyalty, and concerns with traditional sanctity. And so the way that you attain power if you are low in the group is by militating in favor of equality and harm avoidance. These are individually oriented foundations. Now, there needs to be a balance between the two, because in prehistory, and really till quite recently, there was a robust association between passing on your genes and getting to the top of the group. So there has to women would sexually select for status, and in polygamous mating systems, this means that under the Bushmen of the Kalahari in the 60s, only about 40% of them passed on their genes. So you have these two sets of moral foundations, and the evidence is that the left are high in individually oriented foundations, and the right are higher in all foundations. They're about the same in all foundations, except perhaps the extreme right. And so what this this means, however, is that broadly, because we were under sort of group selection pressures, fighting other groups and so on, we're going to be selected to be intelligent, yes, group oriented, and religiosity tends to take that which is adaptive and make it into the will of God at the group level. So therefore, religious, and these things become pleiotripically related into a kind of fitness factor that was under selection. And my argument was that with the collapse of harsh Darwinian selection, with the collapse of child mortality from approximately 40% in 1800 to something like 1% or even less than 1%, I think it is now, today, what you're going to get is a massive build-up in mutation. And that mutation will be in the direction, broadly, of being away from being conservative, being intelligent, and being religious. And that's what we find. Those three things are pleiotripically related, and mutation, i.e., direct evidence of mutational load, things like an asymmetrical face, left-handedness, evidence of developmental instability, are associated with the opposite of that cluster which was under selection. And what we proposed was eventually the build-up in mutation is such that a kind of a tipping point is reached. And when that happens, you're going to go from extreme group orientation, which is what we had for various reasons, to the opposite very quickly, because there's evidence that when about 20% of the group believe the up-and-coming thing, then people tip over very quickly. So you have that tip over into then runaway individualism, runaway concern with equality, runaway concern with harm avoidance, and until it becomes and the reason why intelligence is a bit of a anomaly with regard to that fitness factor is that, yes, intelligence is associated with fitness, but it's genetically associated with alleles associated with mental and physical health. But it's also associated with social conformity. And so because intelligent people are better able to look around the world, to norm map the world, to understand the benefits of conforming, and to force themselves via effortful control to conform. And then once they do so, then you have runaway conformity, runaway individualism. Now, what this does is it goes from putting people on an adaptive roadmap of life, which says, do things that are adaptive to ensure that you pass on your genes and your group triumphs, to a maladaptive roadmap of life, where you're told, it's good to be gay, and it's good to cut off your genitals, and it's good to not have children, and don't have children for the sake of the environment, don't have children for the sake of the climate, all this sort of thing. And you accrue social status because of this. So it takes you basically into this world, this maladaptive world. And what we proposed was that this would become a kind of a selection event. The people that would survive this would be those that were very high in these adaptive traits for ethnocentrism, conservatism, religiosity, and natalism, for genetic reasons. And I look in the book, in both that book and an earlier book called The Past as a Future Country, and we show that if you control for intelligence, if you look at just the top quartile of intelligence, then the big predictor of fertility is that you are conservative and you are religious, and these things have a heritability of about 0.6, perhaps even 0.7 in the case of extreme religiosity. And the big predictor of sterility is that you are liberal and that you are an atheist. And so what this means is that everybody that's highly intelligent, that's not, or reasonably intelligent, that's not congenitally religious or congenitally conservative, gets sucked into a death cult. Now, you make a good point that could have that has probably a moderate, even dysgenic effect in terms of intelligence, because of course it means that the more intelligent, on average, are slightly more likely to be sucked into this death cult via their higher social conformity, which is perhaps then exacerbated by the fact that they go to a university or whatever that indoctrinates them with this stuff. So that is true. But then on the other hand, you could also almost argue that's a good thing, that the system is creating dysgenics and thus collapsing the system, which is further causing high mutational load. I mean, if it carried on, if civilization carried on forever with nothing to collapse it, then eventually, when the next meteorite hit, a la Graham Hancock, our intelligence and by extension our health would be so low that we would all just die. And so that's why we argue that woke eugenics is a necessary evolutionary adaptation to bring us back ultimately to genetic health. And part of that may perhaps involve being less intelligent. Although the interesting thing is that this process is happening among the more intelligent. This process that it's among the more intelligent that the big predictor of facility is conservatism and religiosity. And what will tend to happen is that eventually the more intelligent take over the culture. So there would then be a kind of a backlash, a percolation up into positions of power, sort of Nick Fuentes types, in Generation Z.
Well, there's a lot there. I'm thinking as you speak of a couple different things. First of all, there's kind of a Darwinian aspect to societies themselves. Societies are not people. They don't have genes, alleles, the way we do. But they have their own lifespan. Probably the healthiest society, and one of maybe the most formidable, was European society before the Great War. But if that society commits cultural suicide, there's Sarajevo and the assassination, and then everything kind of all the dominoes fell on top of each other. There was calamity, and it led into the second World War. And society hasn't quite been the same. There's a lot of kind of rearguard action to cover it and whatnot. Now societies don't have the same actual genuine life that people do. I have a heart, I think, it beats, so forth. Societies don't have that, but they do have something akin to that. And it's kind of an interesting concept of how the intelligent individuals can filter up and change the societies, or vice versa, that the societies can kind of like tap the creativity and the intelligence of the people beneath. So, in your book, you mentioned, kind of eugenics, kind of as I think, a much more broadly popular movement than people might think now. And now it's pretty much a curse. I was in a little chat the other day, and it was pointed out to discredit Jonas Salk, the inventor of the polio vaccine. He was a eugenicist. Now, there's all different types of this, and there are people, I think, if you just take the term itself, you want something good for the society, but the society itself, obviously there's, the Hitlerian aspect of eugenics taken to an extreme, where you eliminate those that are considered inferior, and it's kind of the disease model of society, cleansing itself. I mean, a whale has a bunch of remors on it to kind of cleanse its skin and whatnot. And the concept for certain, the extreme eugenic society is that, you have to cleanse your society of those parasites and whatnot that are, living within it.
I think that, well, I question to what extent. There's a lot to unpack there. I mean, first of all, if you say humans are different from human collectives, which is what societies are, well, that's true. But in much the same way, you could argue that the allele, or the gene, is different from what they are with the human, which is a collection of genes. It's just sort of taking the metaphor further, in the same way that we can talk about gene selection, we can talk about the selection of individual clumps of genes, i.e., certain kinds of human, and we can talk about the selection of individual of clumps of genes at a more extended level, i.e., different kinds of society. It seems that societies, civilizations, let's be more specific, age in quite a predictable way, which is that they are under harsh Darwinian selection pressures, which strongly selects for intelligence and strongly selects for what you might call asabiar, Khaldun and all that, being highly group oriented and pro-social and things like this, cooperative. And eventually, this seems to lead to what we might call the various markers of civilization. This leads to an easing of the selection pressures because we essentially create for ourselves a kind of artificial warm period via civilization. This leads to a build-up in mutational load in the population. This leads to weakened selection, which will then lead to inclinations which would be normally maladaptive or odd, such as, I don't know, homosexuality, feminized men, masculinized women, atheism, whatever. And then and it also leads to the society just becoming stupider because there was indeed from data we have from the 16th century from wills and parish records, we know that the richer 50% of the population had double the completed fertility of the poorer 50% of the population. So what you're basically getting in under harsh Darwinian selection pressures is a bootstrapping of the population every generation. The bottom of the generation, the bottom of society die off, and the next level moves down to occupy the places that have been vacated. And so essentially the genes of the nobility, the genes of the top society, are moving the way down. We can basically conceive of it as a situation whereby the ethnic group is self-genocided by its nobility. And so it's not the intelligent moving up, as you said, it's the intelligent moving down. And that's what happens in a society of harsh Darwinian selection. Now, what starts to happen under high civilization is, for some reason, intelligent people stop wanting children. This is noted during the time of Augustine, that the higher classes, which correlates with intelligence at about 0.5, stop wanting children. They just stop, and he imposed a tax on childlessness in the upper classes, and they paid the tax. And what I think it might be happening, well, first of all, you have innovations such as contraception, which is basically an IQ test to have the impulsivity, the lack of impulsivity to use it, or the intelligence to use it properly. Do you take the pill at the same time every day like you're supposed to, or do you knock it back with a glass of red wine when you remember? So there's that. There's the rise of welfare because you have extra resources, and this encourages the lower classes to have children. At the moment in the UK, the only group among the natives that has above replacement fertility is those that have both parents where families with both parents are on welfare. There's feminism, which is a product perhaps in part of a general collapsing group orientation and a rise of individualism, which means that old values are questioned, the religion is questioned, people stop believing in God, the religion is questioned, ethnocentrism doesn't hit in, and so then you get women encouraged into education, they delay and limit their fertility if they're more intelligent, if they're less intelligent they get pregnant and have kids by loads of unsuitable men. And then I think it's just this evolutionary mismatch, which is what civilization is. We are evolved to be surrounded by death all the time. That's our evolutionary match, right? About 50% child mortality, death all the time. And when that happens, then certain adaptive instincts that we have, such as ethnocentrism, such as belief in God and the belief that life has eternal meaning, and such as a desire for children, are induced. And it seems that people that are more intelligent are more environmentally sensitive. They are less instinctive. They have less hardware, as it were, and more software. And so this makes sense implicitly because solving a problem, particularly, let's say, certain kinds of mathematical problem, often involves rising above your instinctive response and logically working it out. So on that basis, it would make sense that people that are intelligent will be more environmentally sensitive. And there are a number of lines of evidence that they are more environmentally sensitive. Being intelligent is associated weakly with being a K strategist, a slow life history strategist. And these people are much more environmentally flexible and plastic. Intelligent people seem to go through puberty later. They seem to learn to walk later. They seem to be, in general, more environmentally sensitive. So if they're put in the wrong environment, it will mess them up in a way that is not true of someone that is much less intelligent. They'll still be highly instinctive. So I suspect that's why they don't want children. And then because they don't want children, eventually the society goes into reverse. There becomes a positive, a negative association between intelligence and fertility, which is at the genetic level at the moment, by the way, and we know that. And so IQ starts going down. we've lost about 20 points since maybe 1800, or sorry, since maybe 1880. And then eventually we can't do things we used to be able to do, and there's a whole interrelated system that collapses us back down to harsher Darwinian conditions, where we are under harsh condition, we become healthy, and then it just starts all over again. And
Yeah.
that's what I think wokeness has come to speed up and to induce, and is needed.
No, there's a lot there. I actually did some work on this in my article on kind of guns relationship or not to homicide, which came out of a back and forth I had with a theoretically smart guy, Ivy League educated and whatnot. And we just kept passing emails back and forth, and so I eventually wove this into an article which didn't get published in the mainstream and whatnot. But I would just kind of put this question to you. I'll set it up. There's kind of this individual IQ aspect, but there's also a societal, kind of like the steps under a piano. There's a tonality that society puts towards IQ, and I'll give you an example. In the Caribbean, the IQ in Barbados is higher than it is in Jamaica. Pretty much the same genetic bunch. The IQ in Australia is, I think the average IQ is 99. Pretty much, the set norm based on the Gaussian normal distribution and setting 100 as average. Whereas, a couple hundred years ago, it was a penal colony. So the worst of the worst were brought to Australia, percolated in the say, a reasonable regime will just stipulate Australia has been compared to other countries. People wind up at the mean. They wind up at the mean intelligence. But in harsh conditions, societally, they don't necessarily have the ability and time to garner those things which might be uncovered on intelligence tests per se. So there are going to be other things that you might need to cope in, say, I don't know, Cameroon or Ivory Coast or whatever, that don't involve being able to sort out an IQ test. So
Well, yeah, I agree with you. I mean, there's a number of interesting points that you make. So first of all, the difference between, I was talking about this last night actually with my friend Lipton Matthews. I don't know if you've heard of him. He's a Jamaican researcher, and he's written for Aporia.
I saw a bit of the video
On Monday. Well,
Yes.
exactly. So he made the very good point that the genetics of the people of Barbados is different from the genetics of Jamaica, and the Jamaicans are mainly from Dahomey, where most of the slaves were from, whereas the people from Barbados seem to be mainly Igbo in Nigeria, and the Igbo are highly intelligent. And the average, by African standards, the average IQ of Nigeria is 70, but the average IQ of Igbo is 85. So one suspects that's relevant. Secondly, he said that the harshness of slavery was appalling in Barbados, mainly because my ancestor ran Barbados. So Sir Richard Dutton, collateral ancestor, was the governor of Barbados. I don't know, but apparently it was, and so of course that's going to act as a selection event, and probably a selection event for health. And health is genetically correlated with intelligence. With regard to Australia, I suspect yes, the early settlers would have been criminals, but they would have been under very harsh conditions once they got there. So that would have been a selection event for intelligence. But secondly, a big part of the population of Australia has come there subsequently, and is particularly the so-called £10 POMs in the 50s. And immigration, being a migrant, is associated with intelligence. So it's going to be more intelligent English people, in particular, that are going to make their way from the mid-Victorian period onwards, when it stopped being a penal colony, to Australia. So I suspect that explains the relatively high intelligence of Australians. My understanding is, if you just look at the white Australians, then their average IQ is actually, based on PISA data, their average intelligence is higher than that of white Britons. Which would make sense, because you would expect emigration like that to be a selection event for intelligence. So thirdly, I think you make a very good point about the nature of the IQ test. This is important. And I have done a study on this many years ago, where I argued that the nature of the IQ, on the one hand, the evidence is clear that the correlation between these national IQs that have been produced by people like Richard Lynn and David Becker, and alleles associated with, essentially with IQ, from the GWAS data, is about 0.9. And these differences strongly correlate with other markers of other intuitive measures of intelligence, such as PISA scores in schools, such as reaction times negatively, and various others. So I think they are robust. There are these differences in intelligence, but there is probably going to be, yes, the degree to which it underestimates the IQ slightly, perhaps, of African countries, because you get kids there that, imagine it, that the guy sits there and shows them how to do the first one, and then they do them. And some of them, for example, with South Sudanese samples, I found it's no better than guessing. It's literally the result they get is no better than guessing. So they're probably guessing. And that's why the IQ ends up being so low, ends up being, 55 or something, because they're just guessing. And you can imagine some of these kids are probably not used to geometric shapes. Maybe they're not even used to paper, and they're just drawing in the mud. So in that sense, it's suboptimal, but the results broadly do correlate with other more concrete and less culturally influenced measures. With regard to problem solving, I did do a video on this idea that when you say that the average IQ of someone like this is 70, and that is borderline mentally retarded by Western standards, normally retarded is said to be 69, it has to be understood that we're talking 70 in a context where that is a genetically healthy IQ to have. Normally, that kind of IQ among a Western person, you are an outlier. You are 3 standard deviations below the mean. And that's probably part of some syndrome or other things that have gone wrong. It's perfectly conceivable that a person with an IQ of 70 in somewhere like I don't know, the Bushmen of the Kalahari or the Pygmies, they have an estimated IQ of about 50, 55. Will have all kinds of modules, all kinds of specialized abilities that are at the base of the IQ pyramid. If you imagine specialized abilities and then verbal, linguistic, and spatial, factor analyzed G, that are highly adaptive and allow them to solve, very specific localized problems. In fact, I think it's very interesting if you note that there is a correlation of about 0.3 between the size of the brain, the encephalization quotient, and IQ. And there are race differences in IQ, and there are race differences in encephalization quotient, and they correlate they parallel in the expected order, except with the Inuit. And they have an average IQ of something like 90, so about that of Greeks or Southern Italians or something, even though it's really cold. And so that would expect selection for intelligence, but they have these massive brains, and that may be because they've got lots and lots of sort of unrelated or weakly related modules to solve specific localized problems, so they have very, very good spatial memory, for example, which is weakly associated with G.
So there's a lot there as well. One thing I don't want to get too sidelined in this, but because you mentioned the Inuit, it's cold up there. I had a professor, Paul Manger, on a couple of years ago, and he does study of cetaceans, whales and dolphins and whatnot, and they are assumed to have intelligence because of the size of their brains, but in point of fact, probably a lot of it's just kind of insulation. They have more white matter than we do, and it's really cold down there. They're living in basically freezing water all the time, day in and day out, and so they have kind of a different brain situation in order to kind of insulate. So that people misinterpret their sounds and whatnot as intelligent. I don't think that's necessarily the case with the Inuit, but
well, the Inuit can do quite complex things, but the evidence for myself and the colleague David Pither are accruing, and he's published on, is that the big, and also there's lots of evidence for this, is that the big thing that caused intelligence to explode was the innovation of agriculture, and there was this sense in which, yes, cold winters theory is weakly associated with intelligence. Latitude is associated with intelligence, but there's all kinds of exceptions to this. And the thing which seems to bring it all together is the innovation of agriculture about 12,000 years ago. Meant that people, well, 10,000, whenever it was, 10,000 years ago, it was 12,000, whichever it was, 10,000 years ago, is a huge selection pressure for intelligence, because you have to be planful and you have to be forward thinking and you have to all this sort of thing, which you never had to be before. You just had to get up and get some food for that day. Even in the winter, big game and things like that in the Ice Age that's what you do. It would be a sort of a daily or at best a weekly thing. But the idea that you would plan a long time in advance and have to kind of understand the nature of the stars and work out from the stars when it was going to, and the moon and whatever, when it was going to be this time to plant this. So it involves a great deal of forward thinking, of low time preference, and that is a significant correlate of intelligence. And so the suggestion is that that's what really pushed things forward in terms of the development of intelligence. And of course, that never happened to the Inuit. The Inuit, it's just too cold to be able to innovate farming.
Yeah. So a couple interesting points. First of all, we hear all these countries with IQs of 70 or 80, whatever, on average. The average IQ, by virtue of the test itself, is 100. And I think the standard deviation, oddly enough, is 15s, by the way. So I'm not sure that I'm accurate on this, but slight quibble. I think 70 is 2 standard deviations off, despite its being 30 numerically. I think Stanford Binet or whoever did this test made the odd choice of 15s being the standard deviation.
Yes, you're right. Sorry, yes, 2 standard. Yes.
Yeah. So anyway, so which countries? If we have all these countries that are below 100, we should have a whole bunch of countries that are above 100. Do we have any of those?
No. The average IQ is 100 for people. You set that doesn't make, I don't see that makes any sense. It's a comparative ratio system. So you you have raw scores, and then you state this is the average. This is the in the bell curve. What we do when we talk about international scores is we say that we always put the English as the average. So it's a Greenwich average. So the British is always 100.
So nobody's right. So
there isn't a huge variation in intelligence in the same way that there is among humans. It doesn't create a bell curve in the same way. So intelligence at the individual level, it does, but at the national level, most of these countries in Europe and whatever, Western Europe, England, Germany, among the native population, the average IQ is the same as the English native population, i.e., it's 100. In terms of more intelligent peoples or groups, the highest that I'm familiar with is the Ashkenazi Jews, where you have an average IQ of 112. And the Northeast Asians, they have an average IQ of about 105 to 108. The Finns seem to have an average IQ of about 100, a few points above the Greenwich mean. The white Australians, white Canadians, and a couple of other groups.
Yeah. Speaking as an Ashkenazi Jew, I always wonder about that. I mean, people, have said, kind of Yiddish Kopf we have, which is, Jewish brain. You're smart, but a lot of that is because the pressure's been on. In the Pale of Settlement in the Soviet and other places as well, Jews were not allowed to own land, and so you couldn't have the kind of, have the farm and whatnot. So you had to be able to pick up your stuff and move on really quickly. And so, this kind of concept of Jews as usurers, loaning money or dealing with jewels and whatnot, that's because, they could pick that business up and move it. It was transplantable. They could be nomadic in a sense because they didn't know when they were going to be pogromed out of one place or another. But you had to, have like a, mathematical mind to do that in order to keep accounts. and be a salesman and whatnot. So
Yes,
you have
there's no evidence. The Romans do not comment on the, well, of course there were the difference wasn't quite so stark then between the different kinds of Jew, but the Romans do not comment on the Jews, because then the distinction wasn't there between Ashkenazi and Mizrahim or whatever. Do not comment on the Jews being particularly intelligent. So the implication, and they do comment on other people's. So the implication is that this is a subsequent, as you say, is that this was caused by things like bottleneck effects, and it was caused by these laws which forced them into usury, which essentially meant that if you weren't intelligent enough to be able to do the jobs which Jews were allowed to do, then you died, and your genes weren't passed on, or you dropped down into the Gentile population and were absorbed somehow into that. So that, and also interestingly, there's some evidence. Of course, this idea that Judaism passes through the female line was not always adhered to, and also it was imposed only in, I think, the Middle Ages. So before you do then get intelligent white girls marrying rich Jews and all this sort of thing. So there's two effects. There's intelligent white people marrying their daughters to Jews or marrying their sons to Jews. And then there's the sort of bottleneck effect that they're focused into those particular high IQ professions. And then there's probably the pogroms. There's probably a degree to which pogroms are a selection event. You're going to not get killed if you're clever enough and forward thinking enough to plan and to get out of the situation, or if you're socially skilled enough to get on with Gentiles and therefore they'll help to hide you or whatever. I wouldn't be at all surprised if, among the Ashkenazi anyway, if the Holocaust was a selection event. And you can completely imagine, well, this is not my idea, this is other people have said this, but I think that would be, you can imagine you're going to get the ones that are more planful and future oriented, and they're in Germany in the 30s, and they say, let's get the hell out of here. Let's go somewhere in Europe. No, let's go to America. Let's get the hell out. Get as far away as we can. And you're going to get the more laid back kind of ones that will say, oh, it'll be all right. And of course, those are the people that are more likely to die off. And then, interestingly, I spoke to an acquaintance who said, and I'm not familiar with the data, because the data on Ashkenazi Jews, by the way, it's very specific. It's Ashkenazi Jews in America on the National Longitudinal Study of Youth. And they seem to have an IQ of 112. And on everything else, it's more sort of proxy measures. For example, among Ashkenazi Jews in Europe, they have a higher percentage of these alleles associated with high IQ than do white controls, which is consistent with the idea that they're more intelligent. And there are many other sort of things like that. So I suppose it's a kind of cumulative case to say beyond America that the Ashkenazis are more intelligent. But then, interestingly, if you compare the Sephardi to the populations from which they've come, i.e., Southeastern Europe and Spain and whatever, they are more intelligent than those populations. They're not necessarily as intelligent. They're not as intelligent as Ashkenazi Jews, but they're significantly more intelligent than the population from which they have come. And likewise, the Mizrahim. What interests me, and this hasn't been done, and I'd love there to be data on this, but is that, Jewish people, of Ashkenazi Jews, have stereotypes within the Ashkenazi community. And one of those is about the Litvaks. So the Jews of the Baltic states. And there's this stereotype that they are particularly intelligent. And if you look at a lot of the sort of the rabbis that are handing down dictates in modern Europe, they're often so and so of Vilnius, and,
right.
Rabbi so and so of Riga. So I'd be interested if that could be somehow broken down. So it would be a more subtle analysis.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's just aren't. It's amazing there's all that kind of parsing, but it's not. We're not that big a group in general. I think it's 0.2% of the world. I get a lot of attention, probably too much attention. One of the things that I was looking at in writing my article, and frankly, I've got a book in galleys on the narcotic issue, and two things would segue into that. A is kind of the maturity aspect you've been talking about, There's an experiment where you give kids the choice of a cookie now or 5 cookies later, something like that. And at age 3 or 4, they always take the cookie now. They don't have any concept of planning and kind of this agrarian aspect. And then kids at 10 or 12, they're like, if they trust you, they'll say, I don't want the cookie now. I'll wait. I'll get the 5 cookies. So that's maturity. My experience with narcotic addicts is that they have less of that ability to wait. They want the pleasure now. There's kind of I had to, back when I was
Is that
doing.
is that the pleasure in relation to a drug or food or something, or just
Well,
more
I think
broad
I
in
think
every aspect?
I think it translates. I don't know per se, and I'm not sure how to study this exactly, but the concept of delayed gratification, that's maturity. That's what gets you a graduate degree. It's not because it's a lot of fun getting some degree or whatever. You're like, oh, I'm doing this, because there's going to be something down the road, and you have to be inured to that, and willing to do it. And then the other thing is not quite a perfect segue, but both in intelligence and in narcotic usage, people improve when they come from East Asia to the United States. So there's in researching my opioid book, I found that there's obviously the Golden Triangle. There's a lot of opium use in Southeast Asia and whatnot, and addiction, so forth. When the Vietnamese and the Laotians and Cambodians come to the United States, they wind up, like the valedictorian class. If you go where I'm in Massachusetts, but you go up and down the North Shore here, most of the high schools where the Cambodian immigrants came, the valedictorians are all, they're Cambodian, like, and they came here not, speaking the language, not even understanding our English, or Roman letters or whatnot. And it's just kind of an amazing thing, so I think it's a lot of
It doesn't
kind of,
necessarily surprise me in the sense that the average IQ of these countries is about 95.
hmm,
So it's not that much lower than England. I mean, it's kind of the average IQ. We're talking the average IQ of sort of Italy, essentially. That's what average
yeah,
IQ they have.
but
Except they have, for various evolutionary reasons to do with dense populations and things like that, extremely high conscientiousness. And that is associated. I think it's associated, I think, more so in terms of doing well at school, or sorry, no, in terms of lifetime education. It's slightly better predictor than intelligence. So you've got then you can imagine that they're in a poor country, but they probably then their IQ is not at its phenotypic maximum. They come to America, it's pushed up to its phenotypic maximum, and it was quite high anyway. And anyway, they're probably the higher classes from Cambodia or somewhere like that anyway. So there's a selection effect in that sense. And then you add to this the fact that they have very high conscientiousness, very low levels of school suspensions and whatever expulsions, things like that. And so you would predict that they would do very well.
well, fair enough. And I actually kind of want to make best use of our time here. Maybe we can switch topics from history to, I suppose, history as it's being written, current events. They're always current events, no matter what day it is. There's something happening, both in Europe and the United States. There are things in obviously capturing our news as the LA riots, which have kind of an ethnic aspect to it, obviously. And in Europe, you guys, I want to say you guys, as far as all the intelligence and whatnot, I mean, there's been kind of an experimentation, I think, from the elites on down, the supposedly the more intelligent types running the governments that I think are vastly inimical towards societal health and procreation, aside from say via Pakistani grooming gangs. Um, so, we have maybe 10 or 15 minutes left. I'm just curious if you want to expound on any things that might, filter through your
Well,
view.
I think that from what I was saying about if we go back to what we're talking about at the beginning and the idea of civilization going through an age cycle, and Spengler's idea of the seasons of civilization, then if you look at the research by Pasha Glub on the fate of empires, then he notes that the winter of civilization is always the same, consistent, with the build-up and mutation consistent, with a decline in intelligence consistent, with instincts not coming in, including religiosity, which sanctifies traditional ideas and so on. And so you end up with feminism, homosexuality, mass immigration, ethnic conflict, atheism, materialism. You see all of these things, and you see them towards the end of classical Athens. You see them towards the end of Rome, and you see them towards the end of Baghdad. And he delineates how this is the case. And I think this is simply what we are seeing now. And so you have a society in England, let's say, of runaway wokeism, runaway virtue signaling, runaway individualism signaling, where you, if you're intelligent, you realize that that's how you get status. And if you're a certain kind of person that goes into politics that probably has dark triad traits, narcissism and things like that, then and Machiavellianism, which are associated with leftism in the moment, then you realize that you have to competitively signal these things, that your moral authority is based around these things, that people telling you you're morally good is protecting you from your deep neurotic inner feelings, which have caused you to create a sort of narcissistic false self. And so you just get this out of control virtue signaling, and then it becomes the system, and then anyone that dissents from that is a danger to the shrill, is a danger to the mentally unstable, is a danger to these mutants. And so there's nothing you can do to stop it. And so it just carries on and on and on until it comes up against a wall. In general, I think things tend to move leftwards as a rule because there's asymmetric empathy. We talk about those 5 moral foundations. Well, conservatives have all 5 of them, and liberals only have 2 of them. So there's asymmetric empathy. So things will move in a liberal direction until there's such dysphoria and such chaos that there's a backlash. And we are beginning to see the beginnings of a backlash, where, look at now, it's Pride Month. Well, it's 2 years ago, there were rainbow flags everywhere in London, and everywhere. Rainbow gay stuff in the media everywhere. It's being gradually put back in the box because people with power and influence are realizing, God, this has gone too far, and there could be a bloody revolution if this carries on. And secondly, they are scenting, they are socially aware, and they are noticing a change in the public mood, and the beginnings of a backlash. And so you're seeing them kind of. So you've both got perhaps a more conspiratorial idea that people that just want power are thinking, oh God, let's raid this back in, like the magisterial Reformation as opposed to the radical Reformation. Or it's that people in power are literally noticing this, and so they are changing sides gradually. And it's the slightly braver ones, well, the really brave people presumably had never been left wing, but it's the slightly braver ones that are moving away and changing sides, and this is slowly changing. And there are a number of consciousness raising moments that have forced this to the fore. The grooming gangs is one. What was the grooming gangs? It was for the fear of being accused of racist, of being accused of being a heretic in the power regime. They were allowed to get away with this for years and years and years. And also, I suppose, that the fact that the girls were working class, there was just sort of a disgust against them. And left-wing people tend to identify with people that are more genetically distant from self anyway, other than do right-wing people. So they're going to identify with the Asians because they can then collaborate with them individualistically against their own people, treasonously, and gain power over their own people. And these are just chavs, scum, If they have sex at 12, well, they grow up quick, these fast life history strategists. So that was consciousness raising when Elon Musk, an outsider, forced it into the consciousness. And then you have the thing in Southport, which was unbelievable, and the various cover-ups that have been seen because of that. And then, of course, just a tipping point has been reached over the chaos and appalling standard of living that we've now got in the UK because of immigration. And there's the collapse of order and the collapse of everything, such that it's ordinary people, rather than those that get particularly annoyed by these things, have now had enough. And so you're seeing a backlash. And then similarly in America, there's probably parallels. What's going on there is just a low-level invasion, isn't it? You've got a virtue signaling left-wing government under Biden. They allow this to happen to sort of to try and alter the nature of the country so that they can stay in power. and they've basically taken over parts of California, and it's theirs. It's their land. It's theirs. Mexico. It's Mexico enclave, and they're in power there. And then you've got someone going in. What do you want from an evolutionary perspective? You want territory. You want territory, and you want numbers. And Trump is interfering with these things. And so of course then you're going to get a backlash, and then left wing people with high neuroticism, as we discussed earlier, and resentment are going to want to tear down everything that they associate with power, and that's Trump, and that's whiteness, and that's the whole, that whole system. And so of course they will identify with the Mexicans and go in from, as you said earlier, from their wealthy neighborhoods, and campaign. And you say, oh, well, they're forcing themselves downwards socioeconomically. I don't think they are. I think they probably go through a phase of behaving like that and then go back and get their trust funds, or go back and daddy finds them a job in Washington working as a lawyer or something like that. So I think that's it's a phase you go through, as I'm sure you know as a doctor, that you go through as you age, neuroticism goes down, agreeableness goes up, conscientiousness goes up. Except for a blip in adolescence and late adolescence, where those things go down. So but intelligence is still going up, as it does until you're in your late 50s or something, raw intelligence. So therefore, you're creating these intelligent psychopaths, who is what they are, people in their 20s, that rebel against the system, which makes sense in evolutionary terms, because of course then they can make the break with the parents. They'll be in the army of the group in prehistory at that age. They can impress the women. So by taking risks. So I think you're seeing the same thing. You're just seeing indications of the winter of civilization. What's interesting is that in Trump, perhaps, we have a kind of Julian the Apostate who is standing up against this. I mean, he could, presumably, if he wanted to, he could really go for it. I don't know why he doesn't. He could just go for it. He could just send in the troops and open fire. But there's nothing to hold him back. He can't be re-elected. But he's not doing that.
Well, it's a question, and the re-election thing is a question because he had a gap of 4 years. But that's not. I'm not going to do constitutional aspects. I just bring up two things that I thought of while you were speaking. Maybe we'll close out. The Roland Garros, the French Open, was won by Coco Gauff, I believe, and she said, she was kind of timid about waving the American flag, which is the kind of thing people do, and she said, "I'm really proud of for the Americans who look like me." And she kept saying that thing over and over again. She wasn't proud for America. She wasn't proud to be American. She was proud that she could be an example for the people who look like her, i.e., Black, African Americans, and so forth. That's one thing that occurred. The second thing is I saw an interview of one of the LA riot individuals, and he took his mask down for a second, and he's like, well, we're La Raza, R-A-Z-A, La Raza, which means the race. And this is, it's not, Mexican per se, but it's the race. And it's kind of an interesting, that's the name of their group. That's been the revolutionary group that kind of sees, that they should recreate not just the Mexican or Spanish, whatever, but the Aztec Empire and recreate the race. And so both those things, Coco Gauff and the La Raza, point out that there's this kind of this ethnic pride that is that maybe supervenes any concept of individual intelligence or even intelligence for the collective. It's kind of the sub-collective, the ones that look like me. And this seems to me kind of a more of a primitive aspect. I'm not sure it's going to be successful over time. And maybe in closing it, if you want to touch either of those topics.
Well, it makes sense in terms of Phil Rushton's genetic similarity theory, for which there is abundant evidence. Even in terms of things like citations in academic journals, you're more likely, on average, to cite someone that's the same race as you, all else being controlled for. You're certainly more likely at college to want to live with people who are the same race as you and marry people who are the same race as you. We operate to a certain degree, though of course there are exceptions to this in terms of socioeconomic interest or whatever, or things that just go above that. But along these kinds of racial and subracial lines, this is just how people operate, seemingly both consciously and unconsciously. And so I think that's why multi-ethnic societies are just doomed to fail. And there's a very interesting book called Ethnic Conflicts by Tatu Vantanen, in which he notes that the single biggest predictor of warfare in a society is ethnic diversity. So ethnic diversity might work if there's one small ethnic group on its own somewhere. But once you have a multi-ethnic society and all kinds of ethnic groups disliking each other and fighting, even the Mexicans and the blacks don't get on. Of course they don't. They're genetically very different.
No, and even in Mexico, there's lots of issues between different tribes and regions. When I was in Japan about now 6-7 years ago, and this concept that's running through my head: diversity is our strength. We hear this over and over again. And but in Japan, I'm sure they have their classes and whatnot. But it was such a peaceful, wonderful place. I mean, you could leave your wallet in the middle of the street, probably come back 2 days later and find it there, or somebody would have brought it back to your hotel, and so forth. It's a high trust society. People get along perfectly.
That you trust people that are genetically similar to you, and of course Putnam's research, E pluribus unum, which he sat on for 10 years, famously proved that social goods collapse in a multi-ethnic society.
But the irony is that Japan's collapsing. They have not really gone for the import the next generation of workers and whatnot, but their own social security system and whatnot is imploding because they don't make any more Japanese. I mean, that's
the choice you have. That's the choice. My friend Paul Morland, who's a demographer, has looked into this. He calls it it's a three-pronged thing. You can have, what do you want? You want economic growth. You want three things: economic growth, maintain and standard of living, maintaining the ethnic purity of the society, immigration. Right? You can have two or three, but you can't have three. It doesn't work. You have to, if you want to maintain economic growth. Oh, sorry, high birth rate. That was it. Economic growth, high birth rate, maintaining the purity of society, ethnic purity. You can't have all three. You can have two or three, but you can't have all three. If you don't want to have children, then you either have standard living go down, you don't have economic growth, or you interfere with the purity and you have immigration. But you can't. That's the.
I understand. Yeah. So Japan. I mean, it's kind of a sadness because I loved Japan, but I'm not sure it's going to be the same. Anyway, all these countries I visited. I was in England in the 1970s. It's a vastly different place from what it is now. So, any closing words for us?
Well, as I've looked at in my books, I think we are living through the winter of civilization. What I suspect is going to happen is there's going to be a collapse, but there's going to be a sort of a Byzantium, rather like there was last time. Civilization will hold out in certain clusters. There are certain little areas, certain little reserves of civilization, and we need to prepare for that. Otherwise, we don't want to be like South Africa. Let's have managed decline, and let's have these neo-Byzantiums where we hold out till things can rise up again next time.
All right, so I'm going to just let's see. Oh, I forgot to put it up. I was going to try to put up your books for people to see, and let's see. Give me a second here, so people can find you. Here's Woke Eugenics: How Social Justice is a Mask for Social Darwinism. And people can find you on X at Jolly Heretic, and they can find you at jollyheretic.com. And you have a panoply and a plethora and a pleomorphic bunch of interests and articles and videos and so forth. And so, last question is: how do you maintain being jolly? And what is your heresy? How does it play out in the Dutton household?
In the household, well, my wife's quite sort of normal, so we don't talk about these things very much. But the heresy obviously is with regard to race differences, sex differences, sexuality differences, all that sort of thing. And how do I maintain being jolly? I don't know, make myself laugh, a nice cup of tea, a few bottles of white wine, that sort of thing. That keeps you jolly.
All right, perfect. Well, I think people can learn a lot from you, maybe just from that epitaph there as well. And where do you recommend people purchasing cravats?
Oh well, you can get them. You can get them any. I tend to get them second hand. So old men die. I go to a flea market. I can pick up
I got
cravats.
that's
So
funny. I got to say,
that's
I've
generally.
got about 400 just regular ties, and I started in medical school. I just they kind of work us so hard. Be a little bit zombified or mummified or whatever on my weekends. I'd walk around and there were these yard sales, and it was Rochester. It was pretty middle, kind of middle America, Rochester, New York, and people were just getting rid of ties, and they had these beautiful silk ties, and they were getting rid of them for like 5 cents at the time. So I just like, oh my God, it's just such incredible things. And so I just collected them. I didn't really wear them, but I kind of grew into it. So I don't know if I have cravats in my future or not, but I certainly enjoyed entertaining yours with you inside of it. So thank you so much for being with us today.
Pleasure. Nice to talk to you. Bye bye.
Bye bye.